there lived a girl named Grace. From the day she was born, Grace was different. While other children in the village had thick, beautiful hair that their mothers would braid with colorful beads and cowrie shells, Grace's head was completely bald. Her scalp shone smooth like polished ebony under the African sun, and no matter what her grandmother tried, special oils, herbs from the medicine woman, prayers to the ancestors, not a single strand of hair would grow. The village children were cruel, as children sometimes are when they encounter something they don't understand. They would point and laugh whenever Grace walked by, calling her names like Egghead and Bird. The worst of them was a boy named Marcus, who seemed to take particular pleasure in making Grace's life miserable. He would gather other children around him and sing mean songs about her appearance, making her the center of unwanted attention wherever she went. Grace's grandmother, Sarah, was a wise woman who knew many of the old stories. She would often tell Grace that her baldness was not a curse but a mark of something special, though she never explained what that something was. "Child," she would say, stroking Grace's smooth head with gentle fingers, "the ancestors have marked you for a reason. One day, you will understand why you are different." But Grace didn't feel special. She felt ashamed and alone. She began wearing colorful headscarves to cover her baldness, but even then, the children would try to pull them off during play, exposing her to fresh waves of laughter and mockery. She started avoiding the village center, the market, and even the school playground. Instead, she would spend her days helping her grandmother with chores or sitting by the river, watching the water flow and wondering why she had to be so different. What the village children didn't know, what even Grace herself didn't fully understand, was that she carried within her an ancient curse passed down through generations of women in her family. It was a curse that could only be transferred through cruelty, specifically, through the act of bullying an innocent person. Each time someone mocked her, laughed at her appearance, or made her cry with their harsh words, the curse would slowly begin to shift from her to them. The first sign came 3 weeks after Marcus had organized a particularly cruel display, gathering half the village children to chant, bald Grace, ugly face," until she ran home in tears. Marcus woke up one morning to find a small bald patch on the back of his head, no bigger than a coin. His mother noticed it while braiding his hair and assumed it was from playing too rough. But by the end of the week, the patch had grown larger, and strange things began happening around him. His family's chickens stopped laying eggs. The vegetables in their garden withered despite plenty of water and sun. His little sister developed a fever that wouldn't break, and the village healer could find no cause for her illness. Marcus's mother began to worry, but she didn't connect these misfortunes to her son's behavior toward Grace. Meanwhile, other children who had joined in the bullying began experiencing their own problems. A girl named Faith, who had once snatched Grace's headscarf and thrown it in the mud, found that her own beautiful long braids began falling out in clumps. Another boy, David, who had pushed Grace into a puddle while calling her names, discovered that everything he touched seemed to break or spoil. The pattern continued for weeks. Each act of cruelty toward Grace was met with a consequence that seemed to grow worse over time. The children didn't realize that their misfortunes were connected to their treatment of the quiet girl they had made their target. They complained to their parents about their bad luck, but no one made the connection. Grace, however, began to notice something strange. As the other children's problems mounted, she found that her own burden was lifting. She slept better at night. The headaches that had plagued her since childhood began to fade. She felt stronger, more confident, though she still wore her headscarves and avoided the other children as much as possible. It was Marcus's grandmother, an old woman named Ruth who remembered the ancient stories, who first began to suspect the truth. She had heard whispers from her own grandmother about a family in the village that carried a special burden, a curse that protected them while punishing those who showed them cruelty. When she saw her grandson's bald patch growing larger each day and noticed how his luck had turned sour, she began asking careful questions about his behavior. The truth came out slowly. Marcus admitted to targeting Grace, to leading the other children in their cruel games. Ruth felt her blood run cold as she realized what had been happening. She knew the old stories well enough to understand that her grandson had brought this upon himself, and that the only way to break the cycle was through genuine repentance and kindness. That evening, Ruth took Marcus by the hand and led him to Grace's small house on the edge of the village. Grace's grandmother Sarah was sitting outside, weaving baskets in the fading light. The two old women looked at each other with the understanding that comes from years of wisdom and knowledge of the old ways. "I think our children need to talk," Ruth said simply. Sarah nodded and called Grace outside. The girl appeared hesitantly, her head covered as always with a bright yellow scarf. Marcus looked different than Grace remembered. Thinner, with worry lines around his young eyes, and a large bald patch visible on his scalp despite his mother's attempts to hide it. "Marcus has something to say to you," Ruth prompted gently. The boy stood there for a long moment, struggling with words that felt too big for his mouth. Finally, he looked directly at Grace for the first time in years, really seeing her as a person rather than a target for his cruelty. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice cracked. "I was mean to you because I was afraid of being different myself. I thought if I made fun of you, nobody would notice that I was scared all the time. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Grace stared at him, not sure what to say. She had imagined this moment many times, someone apologizing for the years of hurt they had caused her, but now that it was happening, she felt more confused than satisfied. "I forgive you," she said softly, because her grandmother had always taught her that forgiveness was a gift you gave yourself as much as the other person. Something shifted in that moment. Marcus felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. Over the following weeks, his bald patch began to fill in with new growth, and his family's string of bad luck came to an end. His sister's fever broke, the chickens began laying eggs again, and the garden recovered its health. But the change went deeper than just the reversal of bad fortune. Marcus began defending Grace when other children made comments about her appearance. One by one, the other children who had bullied her came to apologize, prompted by their own experiences with unexplained misfortune and the wise words of grandparents who remembered the old stories. As the bullying stopped, Grace found herself changing too. She began joining in village activities again. She made friends with some of the quieter children who had never participated in the mockery. She even began to feel comfortable removing her headscarf sometimes, letting her smooth scalp catch the sunlight without shame. The curse that had marked her family for generations began to fade, its purpose fulfilled. Grace learned that she had been chosen not as a victim, but as a teacher, someone whose difference would eventually lead others to examine their own hearts and choose kindness over cruelty. Years later, when Grace became a teacher herself, she would tell her students the story of how she learned that being different wasn't a punishment but a gift. She would explain that sometimes the things that make us stand out are the very things that help others learn important lessons about acceptance and compassion. And though her hair never did grow, Grace learned to wear her baldness like a crown, a symbol of the strength that comes from surviving cruelty and the wisdom that comes from choosing forgiveness. The village children, now grown with children of their own, would point her out to their little ones as an example of true beauty, the kind that comes not from how you look, but from how you treat others and how you carry yourself through the world. The old curse was broken, replaced by a new kind of magic, the power of a community that had learned to see difference as something to celebrate rather than something to fear.